All right, with that, I have 7 minutes and my time begins now. We affirm the resolution that this House prefers a centralized government to a federal one. First of all, we'd like to start by defining this House as the judge, which means that if the judge at the end of the day prefers the centralized government to a federal one, then the vote should be in favor of the affirmative. And thus, we define this as a fact ground, which is based off of the truth of the resolution. On to some quick definitions. We define centralized government as as having the federal government maintain all the power versus a federal government is one that the states and the nation share the power among each other. Some examples of a centralized government are China, France, Indonesia, Portugal, the UK, and Vietnam. An example of a federal government is the United States. All right, now that those definitions have been established, let's move on to our first advantage, which is gridlock. So the first argument here is that the federal government is generally very bureaucratic. The problem here is that there is an extremely lengthy process in order to get bills passed by the House and get them Senate approved in the United States. For example, in 2019, the Senate passed only 24% of bills that were introduced because of this system. And the problem with that is that when there are so many competing interests, we see less than 4%. Sorry, thought it was a 2. But yeah, less than 4% of all bills. And the problem here is that there are so many differing interests that when it comes to the state and the federal government, that things simply aren't able to get passed. This is because states are very divided. For example, we can look to the huge cultural differences between the South and the North's partisan rivalry, or even differences between the East and West on things such as abortion rights. The problem here is that the second argument is that there are no policies that are able to be passed because of this. We can look at two major examples to prove our point. The A is the economy. Due to Biden's Build Back Better plan, this would have provided universal pre-K, healthcare, tax incentives for green energy, but it was never passed because of gridlock in the House and the Senate. The issue here, the reason that this is a problem of federal government is because when the federal government encourages so many different states to have their own opinions and their own voices, then we have less of a sense of national unity. And that is why things are not passed. That is why we do not see us being on the same page and not being able to pass any policies. The second argument here is climate change. The House of Representatives has debated climate change policies over the past 30 years. However, since then, we've seen no significant action. We can see that the United States, being one of the largest climate change emitters, is only ranked 28th under climate change legislation. So the problem is, if a federal government is so great, why can't we pass policies that we have been debating for 20 years? Whereas, on the other hand, let's take a look at the European Union. Many of the European Union states are all centralized governments, like the ones I listed in the beginning of my speech. And the EU is actually able to adopt a ton of climate policies. Sweden and Denmark alone have some of the best climate policies in the world and are able to more effectively address these through things like carbon taxes, whereas the United States is not. Look to how Joe Manchin, the senator, rejected Biden's climate change policies that would help. The impacts here are extremely important because this means that we are suffering from things like biodiversity loss, death, and even more from climate change simply because we cannot get ourselves to agree on a policy. The final argument here is that centralization will solve. Like I said before, the EU has adopted multiple climate change policies and actually cut their greenhouse gas emission by 30% since 1990, and that has only been on a decreasing trend since then. This is because the states have more autonomy in them because states in the federal government have more authority, then they argue amongst each other and are unable to get things passed. Let's go to the second advantage, which is on unity. Now, there are a couple major arguments here. The first argument is the blank check. Right now, we see that in a federal system, people have to pay taxes to the states and the federal government, which can be problematic for a couple reasons. The US taxpayer money, since this goes to both federal and state governments, it's collected twice, but it doesn't always go in the same place. In the federal government, for example, most of the tax money is gone into things such as Social Security and Medicare, social programs or welfare programs that can actually help individuals. However, when the tax money is given to the states, it can be attributed to anything. Sometimes states can spend tax money on infrastructure or education, things that are important. But other times, they can focus on things like cracking down on people who carry marijuana or tightening prison restrictions, or things that don't actually help the welfare of their citizens. Because there is no one set pathway on how to spend that taxpayer money, we see that some states are having a greater quality of life, whereas others are not, simply because they're allocating the money incorrectly. If we had a centralized government, it would fix that because now the taxes would be able to go solely to the central government, which means that people would have to pay less. And second of all, when that money does go to the central government, then they can spend it on more effective systems, which have worked in the past. Now, the next argument on this unity advantage is the national security argument. Because of the centralized board making decisions in a centralized government, it is easier to execute decisions because you know they're coming from the top. The country can also easily mobilize to prevent some sort of statewide issue. For example, if an issue such as 9/11 happened, that was an excellent time of when centralization was able to take place, and the entire United States was able to unify amongst each other, create a collective body in order to take action. And that is why policies were able to get passed. Similarly, things would happen like that in a centralized government, except we don't need a war or some sort of major event to cause it. That's just how it's going to be. Additionally, we can see that this is extremely important in diplomacy because rather than every state making their own decisions on, for example, exports and imports, we have one collective body making decisions because the national government is in charge. This increases communication and transparency among stakeholders and thus creates a better quality of life for all. Finally, the third and final argument on this contention is the decreased amount of costs. We can see that when there is only one government, it decreases billions of dollars in administrative costs that it takes to uphold all of these individual, local, and state governments. This can also help the economy because once there is less money to spend on all of these administrative duties, then it can be easier to fuel that money somewhere else and spend it tackling national crises such as COVID-19, which can only be solved through a national approach and not a state approach. So ultimately, at the end of the day, what do we see? A centralized government creates better social spending, which creates a better quality of life for individuals. They create a better centralized approach to relationships with other countries, meaning that we have better diplomacy. And finally, we can improve our economy through a one-size approach. Thank you, and I urge an affirmative ballot.
Okay, I'm just gonna get my timer set up and then I will begin if everybody's ready. Is everybody good? Okay, my time will start on my first word. Okay. So we negate the resolution that a centralized government is better than a federal one, and beginning on our first contention of a balance of powers. So the federal government has three parts, and no one can abuse the system like a tyranny. For example, so a federalized government has three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial, and this equally balances out all powers. And a centralized government, on the other hand, is bad because the executive and legislative branch will be connected. Now, this is bad because there will be no equal representation, meaning that less voices will be heard. A federalized government promotes political participation and encourages economic equality, and the federalized government enforces rules of society, foreign defense, foreign affairs, economy, and public services. So, with this balance of powers, all voices are equally represented, as opposed to a centralized government where there's not as many voting rights and no power can take over another, which leads me to my second contention about abuse of powers. If we were to switch to centralized government here in the United States, the government will abuse powers and take advantage. For example, like an oligarchy or monarchy. Only a small percent will hold power, and those powers will be centralized to the top of the pyramid, and those people and voices will get the voice of everybody, and it won't be as equally represented as it is here in a federal government. And they essentially get to choose how they want to run the economy and not what the voices of other people would want. This would mean, again, like I said, an impact of less voting rights for minorities, and less voices will be heard. This can eventually also lead to an economic depression by uninformed tyrants and oppressed elected officials, like we've seen in history with federal governments, with different kings and rulers. So again, like if all powers aren't equally represented with the three branches like we have right now, then this can lead to a large abuse of powers with unequal representation for all. This brings me into my third contention about the American Revolution. Like we've seen in the past, this was an epic political and military struggle waged between 1765 and 1783 when 13 British North American colonies rejected imperial rule. And then this protest began in opposition to taxes levied with colonial representation. So we have fought so hard for the federal government we have today for all voices to be equally represented. So if we were to switch to centralized government, this would initially take all the work we have done and just throw it away. Throughout this battle, we lost many American lives who fought for our government and fought to be where we are today. And look how far we've come, and why would we take that away? Our founding fathers, such as Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, and fought for our independence. And that was what this whole American Revolution was about, was fighting for our independence. And yes.
Oh, hi. I have a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
So, do you agree with our definition of this house?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you.
So like I was saying, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so basically to summarize, we right now have a balance of powers, equal representation in all three branches of government, executive, judicial, and legislative. And if we were to switch to centralized government, this would result in an abuse of powers. And since we've come so far and we've seen in history with things like the American Revolution, this could lead to another struggle if all voices aren't equally represented, like we've seen with the fight we've had for our independence. So yeah, thank you. And we strongly urge you to vote for the opposition.
All right, thank you so much. Now I'll go on to my speech.
If you guys give me a quick
off-time roadmap, I'll be going into just some overviews and then going into the negation case in order that they presented before moving on to the app case in order. All right, with that, I'll start my time now. Judge, as an overview on their first disadvantage of tyranny, my opponents make the argument that there will be a dictatorship and no representation with the central government. While this sounds true in theory, we must keep in mind that being centralized doesn't mean being non-representative. We would still have all of these minority voices heard. We're the only ones. We would still have these minority voices heard in the government. Look to Sweden, Denmark, France, all of these examples that my partner brought up in her first speech. Those are all examples of centralized governments, and they are not dictatorships. Now let's move on to some specific arguments that they made in their first disadvantage. They argued about the three branches of government and the balance of power between all three branches. However, you can see that when we have a state government, we're still having balance of power within those states' governments. We're seeing direct representation in states. Right now, we have all of these senators, all of these congressmen in Washington, D.C., and they're all making these decisions, but none of them are actually able to get passed because of this gridlock. When we go into a state government, we're seeing that the governor and all of those state legislature will be working together to create policies that best represent that state's interest. And if for some reason that they're not making good policies, you can still vote them out. There is still a check-back system to prevent dictators from arising in centralized governments. Secondly, I would argue that we can see more tyranny happening in federal governments because we have the president at the top that can pressure senators and congressmen to vote a certain way. However, in centralized governments, we can see that the governor has no pressure from other leaders to enact policies that would enact certain policies. Yes, I'll take your POI right now.
What do you define as the check-back system? Can you?
Yeah, for sure. So the checkback system is basically this. If a person doesn't like a certain policy being passed in the state, in the next election cycle, they can simply vote them out. So we're not seeing tyranny and dictatorships arise. Rather, we're having a more efficient form of government where people can still vote them out, and where leaders are not going to be pressured by the president or by other people to vote in a certain way. Now let's move on to their second argument, which is that of abuse of power. This is basically the same argument as before. We can still see a balance of power occurring. We're still having people's voices heard, and I would argue we're having more voices heard, because now the people's interests in a specific state will be heard by the governor. They're not going to be ignored in Congress. For example, let's say California wants to pass a climate change bill. They introduce it in Congress under the federal system, but it's not passed because of all this gridlock happening. Versus in our world, in the centralized government, we're seeing that climate change bill will be taken up by the state legislature in California, and that will probably have a higher probability of being passed because we're not having all these other voices. We're not having all this gridlock. Centralized government. Okay, state voices. Second, they argue about economic depression occurring within the centralized government. We're seeing that economic depression is occurring right now in the United States as a result of COVID-19. Not many bills have been passed to prevent all this from happening. Versus if you look into the EU countries in Europe where they have a centralized government, they are doing better economically because they don't have all this gridlock occurring. Now let's move on to their third argument of that, which is that of the American Revolution. My partner asked a question, which is that do you agree with our definition of this house? We said that this house means that the people in this room, which means you, the judge, has to decide whether centralized government is better or whether a federal government is better. Which means we're not arguing what is better necessarily for the United States. We're arguing is centralized or is federal government. Which means that this argument is invalid because it's specifically talking about the interests of the United States federal government. But even if you don't buy that, why should we continue with an ineffective government? Yes, the US fought hard 200 years ago to break away from Great Britain. But right now, policies aren't being passed. It is a very inefficient form of government. We should not be continuing with more inefficient policies. Rather, we should be looking what is best for the people, and what is best for the people is a centralized government. With that, let's move on to the advantages of the affirmation's advantages. Our first advantage is that of genocide, which is that of gridlock. Sorry, I misspoke, which is that of gridlock. Look to my partner's statistics about how the Senate passed less than 4% of bills introduced in 2019. What is the point of having a federal government if it doesn't pass important policies? The purpose of the government is to be for, by, and of the people. And right now, it is not doing its job of listening to the people's voices and passing good policies. Second, look to my partner's specific examples of no policies being passed of economic policies and climate change bills. My opponents make no responses here. Does this mean that we're not going to pass important policies? We have less than 7 years to solve for climate change. And right now, no bills are being passed. We are ignoring a pressing problem that will cause death, coastal flooding, biodiversity loss, and all of these great impacts from occurring, which means that centralization is going to be much better because states will pass these policies. There's a higher probability of those being passed. Second, on the second advantage of unity, look to the argument that we said that even if you believe that states are good and have voices heard, the in-state policies are also non-uniform and bad. Look to the blank check system that we explained. Right now, US taxpayer money goes to federal and state governments and this whole tax collection system, which creates a lack of uniformity. Under a centralized system, there would be a specific uniform policy that would best help the state. That would best help the state. Second, on the argument of national security, we're seeing that a centralized government makes better decisions. They're easier to execute than a federal government. A country can easily mobilize to prevent some statewide issue. My opponents make no responses here, so you can see that a centralized government is much better for efficiency. Third, now let's go on to some weighing between centralized and federal governments. On time frame, a centralized government means that policies will be passed as soon as possible. The federal government has a history of not passing policies on time. Look to how it's been 30 plus years to pass a single climate change bill. Imagine how much could have been passed if we had a centralized government. Second, on the issue of magnitude. A centralized government is able to quickly respond to crises like COVID-19 much quicker. Look to the EU; it was able to mobilize, able to get stuff better, and right now it's doing much better economically as a result of the centralized system. The federal government is disorganized and is unable to quickly mobilize. Third, on the weighing mechanism of probability. We have a higher probability of solving when we have individual states working together, or individual states passing policies that best represent their people's voices, rather than having 50 senators all gridlock, all debating in the Congress, and all having this gridlock happening, and nothing really getting passed. So at the end of the day, Judge, I ask you one question. Should we have an efficient form of government that best represents the people's voices? Should we have good policies being passed to better the lives of the American people? If that is the case, you should vote for the affirmative, because centralized government is is more efficient and gets good policies from passing. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? Is everybody ready? Yes. Okay, my time
Just need a
begins.
moment to capture a note. 10 seconds.
Okay.
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, my time begins on my first word. Sorry, 1 second. I'm setting up the timer. Okay, so starting on the refutation from my opponent stating that a centralized government is more efficient than a federal government, and they said that it was based on their example of that the Senate only passed 4% of the bills, and I believe that this is highly improbable. While this may be true, that because we have been in a global pandemic for a while, things have slowed down, so there was less of a response, and a federal government is efficient as it has been able to carry multiple different federal countries throughout history and time. And there's a reason that our founding fathers chose a federal government, as a federal government has a balance of power, and not one section will have more power than another section, which will lead to an abuse of power, which, as we know, is bad. And so our opponent also mentioned gridlock based on how states will not be able to have voices heard, but this may not necessarily be true, because now that we have state governments and they all are under a federal government, under a country government, a presidency or something, then this would lead to more voices and representation, as in every state has representatives which talk for our states, which leads to a better representation of all and minorities' voices being heard. The gridlock doesn't really apply because if there's one centralized government, I don't understand how a lot more voices will be heard, as stated by our opponents. It doesn't come through, because if there's a centralized government and there's something more like a tyranny or a dictatorship, then there's more chances of an abuse of power and unable to be pushed for new climate impacts and other things that would allow for voices and things to be heard and more equality for all.
And this would lead us to an economic and social depression because multiple things will not happen. And yeah, so back to our contention about the balance of powers. So we can bring this back to how a centralized government is not a balance of powers. And you can bring this to that a centralized government at the end of the day is a centralized government. And centralized government has a few people in charge instead of multiple people in charge to keep them in check. And the double check system that our opponents had mentioned, it doesn't completely allow for like it's not better because our opponents said that the checkback system, the checkback system is they vote them out in the next election, but what are they going to do until the next election? There is no way for them to vote them out during their run as a person in office. So therefore, they could continue passing things that would be bad and create a bad environment and would take the country or state or province into a bad and economic depression because of their views and different beliefs, which would be bad and would lead for a bad thing. This is exactly why a federal government is better, because a federal government is balanced and there is a lot of people that are being accounted for. And in the local elections, you can vote for your choices and beliefs, and then those would be brought up in a bigger setting in order to be passed into bills and eventually made into laws, which would benefit not only me, but you and everybody else in the country and in multiple different countries. So, in the abuse of powers, we can bring this back to like we've seen multiple and countless times in history how a centralized government could lead to a war or even an economic depression. Such there's many examples such as like dictatorships and other things. So yeah, and this would lead to less voices being heard and of course an economic depression, as I've talked about. And so a balance of power leads to political participation and encourages equality, and it would mean no voices are being heard less than other voices, which in a centralized government, less voices will be heard, which means minority will not get the vote. Freedom, we've fought for everything, and we're simply using the American Revolution as an example of how the United States has fought for their freedom and equality, and the founding fathers have chosen to make a federal government so that we can really practice and execute equality for all, and minorities' voices will be heard. So, yeah. So, back to my opponent's argument about unity and how a centralized government is more united. I mean, you could say that this is true in some standpoint because a unified government in a centralized government is because there's only a small concentration of people in power. So of course the whole government is in unity, and that's because of that. But should be less unity in a federal government because there is more spread out, but this would also lead to a better standpoint and more voices being heard because nobody agrees on the same things. But this would lead to better representation for all. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? Okay. My time will start on my first word. So let me set it up. Okay. My time will start now. So, as we've stated throughout this debate, we strongly negate the resolution that a centralized government is better than a federal government. For many reasons that my partner stated, I will begin on the topic of unity. As we've stated before, in a centralized government, there is unity because there is such a small amount of representation. However, in a federal government, when we have all three branches, Congress, everything, there's so many different opinions, different standpoints, different perspectives of how the government should be run, that all these voices are being put, and all these voices are representing a large percentage of the population. So that just everyone gets a say in what they want in local elections and more larger countrywide elections as well. Just again to talk about our points about balance of power, I started this with saying that we have such a strong balance of powers, and like we've stated before, we have had hundreds of years where we've had a federal government and it has worked very well. And like we said before, yes, the pandemic has slowed down and there has been less bills passed than there would normally be, but that we've slowly seen that start to pick up again. And this just allows for everyone's voices to be heard, which is, in the end of the day, the most important thing is that everyone is being represented. Everyone has a say in the government and in the world they're living in. But again, like if we switch to a centralized government, which we haven't ever done, we wouldn't know if it would run so smoothly like other countries, like you guys have stated, such as like Sweden, France, and Portugal. This could lead to an abuse of powers. And we have historical examples, which our partners don't have, about America and how we would be if we had a centralized government. But we know that we have fought for freedom in the American Revolution and many other examples. But about that. Then just to talk a little bit more about my opponent's points and arguments. A centralized government won't be more efficient, and there's no proof that more voices will be heard. Like we have been stating throughout the debate, if anything, there will be less voices being heard. And again, like we can lead into a deeper economic depression, worse than it is, right now. And also, uh, like I've stated, we don't know if there will be a strong balance of powers. And it doesn't, you know, talking about their check back system, if the people don't like a certain policy, that they can vote it out. How many policies will there be that need to be voted out if we are in a centralized government, since there will only be a specific group of opinions being stated? And just in general, we have had this federal government for such a long time, hundreds of years, and it has worked so well for our society and our our economy and everything. So if we were to switch to that centralized government, there could be severe consequences and a severe downfall in our economy that can just lead to more depressions and can lead to not even good relationships with other countries. So yeah, we have historical examples. There will be an abuse of power. There won't be equal representation like there is now. And for these reasons, we strongly negate there being a centralized government in the United States. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. This will be the final affirmative speech of the debate, and the order is going to be an overview on the negations arguments and then on the affirmative arguments, and then doing some weighing on both sides. All right, cool. With that, my time begins now. At the end of the debate, this round should be evaluated through the lens of the truth. And essentially, we're going to be talking about all countries, not just the United States, due to the resolution, the wording of this House. So we want to be looking at which side is helping the citizens, the world, and the government to the maximum ability that they can. So let's do a quick overview here. What do we consider a good government? Both sides want a democracy that is representative and creates the best policies for the people. But throughout this debate, we have proven time and time again that centralized governments are better at responding to crises than federal ones. And because of that, we believe that the affirmative should be given the ballot in this debate. Let's start with the two major arguments that my opponents bring up throughout this debate: tyranny and the origins of democracy. Let's start with the tyranny warrant. They talk about how in a centralized government, there will be fewer political participation, there will not be that much representation, and thus we cannot have voices heard. Now, there's a couple problems with this. First of all, look at the arguments that Tamana makes about the check-back system. Under a centralized government, people can still vote their state leaders out. They say that these people will just be voted in we cannot do anything about this in the election cycle, but the problem is that happens in federal governments as well. This is non-unique because if someone like Joe Manchin is currently voted in the Senate, he can't be voted out until the next election. The same thing happens with a centralized government. You might be wondering, then what's the difference? The difference is, whereas the centralized government just includes representatives from the states, the federal government not only includes representatives, but they also have the states make their own decisions. And that is really where things start to get chaotic. Now, let me give you a quick example just to prove my point. Even if you believe that the federal government or a federalized government increases the amount of voices heard, what is the point of having these voices heard if they don't do anything about them? Let's look to Black Lives Matter, for example. Even though we had so many voices heard because of that, if nothing was actually happening, if no policies were getting passed on the federal and state on the federal level, then there was no point in having these voices heard at all. Essentially, here we're proving that the political participation will happen in both worlds, but it's just who is executing it more effectively. Their second argument is the origins of democracy. They essentially say that we fought for this government 300 years ago, so we should continue with it now. Not only does this not take into account the current perspectives, but it focuses on an outdated tradition. What is the point of continuing with an ineffective government, like we say time and time again? In addition, even if you believe that maybe we should uphold something for the sake of tradition, there are really no impacts to having this sort of democracy that we've had for 300 years. The only impacts we should be focusing on are the ones that help the people of America and the people of other countries. So with that stated, let's move on to our own contentions. You can't ask whys in this. Do you mean to state a point of order? Okay, sorry, I paused my time. I'll continue it now. Continuing on with our contentions, the first major argument that I want to bring up is the economy. So this is one of the biggest conceded arguments in the debate, and my opponent's only major response is that a centralized government will increase economic depression. This is simply a claim with no warrants to back it. We have proven that the United States, as a federalized government, was unable to effectively handle a crisis like COVID-19, causing millions of people to die. But in other countries like France and Sweden, they were able to increase this mobilization quickly, have the vaccines and masks distributed, and that is why they were able to manage this crisis better. Not only this, but we can see that the EU, which is made out of many, many centralized countries, is doing better than the United States economically. And the United States is currently in a recession. So if we're really looking at the historical facts and the statistics, we can see that the centralized governments are better off at handling economic crises. And finally, on our final argument on the argument of ineffectiveness and gridlock. My opponents say that it's good to have voices, and they say in their speech that it's okay if nobody agrees on something in the federal government, but that means they're okay with no policies getting passed. Make an efficient system, not an inefficient system. Right now, we haven't even passed good climate change policies for 30 plus years because of gridlock. We have less than 7 years to solve for things such as climate change, so we need to act now and not in 30 years, not when we still have a federal government. Finally, my opponents say that the federal government was unable to pass policies because of, for example, COVID-19. But let me point you to the statistic that we brought up on how the Senate passed only less than 4% of bills. This statistic was in 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic even happened. So they really cannot make any excuses for the ineffectiveness of the federal government, except for the fact that it is a federal government. So at the end of the day, let's do a little bit of weighing on both sides. We can see that if we're looking for time frame, if we're looking to solve things in as soon as possible in the next 10 years, central governments get it done, not federal. If we're looking for magnitude, who can save the most lives, who can respond to these crises and help the economy, we see that central governments, once again, are the solution, whereas the federal government is disorganized due to gridlock. At the end of the day, we believe that we should vote for a government that is for, by, and of the people. Vote for an effective system, vote for the centralized one. Thank you.
Give me a moment to submit my ballot, and then I'm happy to disclose if you guys would like to.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, my ballot is in. Gov, I saw you guys nodding that you want me to disclose. Is that correct? And
Yes,
Opt,
I
do
do.
you guys want me to disclose? Okay, perfect. My ballot went to Gov this round. Overall, looking at the flows, lots of dropped arguments on the opposition side. Excuse me. And overall, the sort of warrant story that the Gov built, I found more convincing overall. And I'll have detailed feedback in the notes for you guys as well. Any questions for me?
Sure. Do you have any feedback on our individual speaking styles?
Yes, absolutely. I greatly appreciated the clarity of both of your speaking styles. I appreciated the pacing. At no point was I like, oh my god, what are they singing? Which is so nice, especially after I judged around in which they were spreading and the paradigm specifically says don't spread. So that was great. Both of you brought a really lovely sense of confidence to your speeches. And even if there were moments when I was like, was that true? It was presented with confidence. So for the purposes of being in a debate competition, you get everything right. Obviously, I'm leaving my bias at the door because that's what we do. So overall, I think both of you are very strong speakers. The only thing I would say, and this is for both teams, that all speakers can work on, signpost. Signpost. Please.
Great. Thank you for your feedback.
Of course. Opt, did you have any questions? All right, well, have a good tournament, you guys. Thanks for giving me a fun round to warm up with.
Thank you
Have a
so
good day.
much.
Thank you for judging.
Thank you.